faithfully conveying value and interpreting great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally's Book Club. Today we'll be discussing Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This novel was published in 1852, 10 years before the American Civil War began. Its highest praise is that it single-handedly accelerated the Civil War, ultimately leading to the abolition of slavery in America. It was also a massive bestseller. Throughout the 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin was America's best-selling novel, second only to the Bible in circulation. Its author became a towering figure in American literature. She visited Europe 3 times and was received by Britain's Queen Victoria. In the Civil War's second year, President Lincoln personally received the author. He told the petite, gentle-looking Stowe, "So this is the little lady who started this great war. Why did Stowe and her novel earn such recognition?" What story does Uncle Tom's Cabin actually tell? Well, before exploring the novel, we must first examine its historical context. North American slave trading began before America's founding, when Southern plantation economies needed massive labor. Colonists realized 10 years' wages for a white indentured servant could buy a black person's lifetime labor. Moreover, as enslaved families grew, with children inheriting slave status, slaveholders gained more profit potential, cementing slavery's prevalence in the South. During the Revolutionary War, to maximize public support, the Continental Army decreed enslaved blacks who enlisted would gain freedom. Thus, some blacks became free during the Revolution and began fighting for broader black liberation. In response, Southern states threatened to secede from the Union. To ease tensions, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act the following year, mandating punishment for anyone aiding escaped slaves. This act deeply angered abolitionists, including the book's author, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She lived in Cincinnati, separated from slave-holding Southern states by just a river. She often saw posters on the street offering rewards for catching escaped slaves, and she herself had hidden them and secretly sent them to Canada. Canada had no slavery, and to Black people back then, it was truly a land of equality and freedom. After the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, Stowe's sister-in-law wrote her a letter. The letter said, "If I could write like you, I'd write something to make folks in this country see how cruel slavery is, an evil institution." Stowe read this letter to her kids, then clenched her fist and said, "I'm going to write. As long as I live, I will write." Now that we've covered the history, let's dive into what Uncle Tom's Cabin is about. The hero of the story is a black slave named Tom. He's called Uncle Tom because slave owners forbade slaves from using surnames or calling each other father and son to keep them dependent. So among slaves, younger ones had to call elders uncle or aunt. Uncle Tom was one such older plantation slave, the most reliable on the Shelby estate, 8 years older than Master Shelby, and he'd been helping the old master run things for ages. Though illiterate, Uncle Tom became a devout Christian under the old master's guidance and prayed every night. Young Master Shelby would read the Bible to him. Uncle Tom was kind to others and loyal to his master. He was well regarded by both blacks and whites. If sent on errands, he'd never run off or pocket money. You could say he was the backbone of the whole plantation. Uncle Tom was allowed his own place by his master, a wooden cabin right next to the big house. Out front, there was a little garden where Tom's wife, a black servant, grew all sorts of fruits and veggies. They had a son too, and the three lived together in that simple but cozy cabin. But even with his high status among slaves, Uncle Tom's fate wasn't his to control. Sure enough, Master Shelby got into debt trouble and had to sell some slaves to pay it off. He thought of Tom. Tom's skills were famous everywhere, and he could fetch a real high price. Actually, Mr. Shelby was considered one of the better slave owners. He never beat or scolded slaves, allowed them to marry, encouraged their faith, and taught them to read the Bible. His son, young Shelby, often played with the slaves, never seeing any difference in their dark skin. But alas, in the face of heavy debts, this kindness was useless. However, although Tom was valuable, he alone wasn't enough to cover the debts. The slave trader saw Mrs. Shelby's maid Eliza, who was graceful and beautiful. The trader wanted to buy her too, but Mrs. Shelby disagreed. So the trader set his sights on the maid's son, Harry, who was only 4 or 5, clever and adorable. To repay the debts, Mr. Shelby agreed to this additional deal: sell the son and keep the mother. Anyone with normal feelings knows how cruel this is. But in the eyes of white people back then, black slaves were just their master's property, seen as intellectually inferior and emotionally numb. So the slave trader advised Mr. Shelby, "Don't worry, that woman, just have the missus buy her some earrings or new clothes as compensation. Problem solved, right?" Stowe fiercely criticized this prejudice and designed a scene in her story later on. On a slave ship, a young black woman slave woke up to find her child had been secretly sold. In grief and rage, she jumped into the turbulent Mississippi River. Black mothers are just like white mothers. A mother's love is irreplaceable. The maid Eliza overheard the conversation between the slave trader and Mr. Shelby by accident and decided right then to flee with her son, Harry. She knew it was extremely dangerous. She could be chased by hounds, torn apart, or shot dead. Sometimes slave owners wanted them alive, so escaped slaves faced tortures like whipping, burning, ear cutting, eye gouging, and more. And as the slave owners put it, it was about making an example of one to deter others. But despite deep fear, Eliza didn't hesitate a bit. She simply grabbed some food, took Harry, and set off. On her way out, she went to Uncle Tom and urged him to escape quickly, too. Hearing his master planned to sell him, Tom was heartbroken. He devoted most of his life to this plantation. He'd worked alongside the master and watched young Master Shelby grow up. He'd built a family here with a wife and child, never betraying his master. Yet now he faced this fate, wondering if he'd ever see his family again. So while he understood Eliza's decision to flee, he couldn't run himself. He was the master's most trusted servant, Tom, his pride. He chose to stay and accept whatever came. Tom's obedience contrasted sharply with Eliza's husband, George, a slave with defiant spirit. George's father was white, his mother black, but the law then determined status by the mother's lineage. Thus, George couldn't escape slavery. Though married to Eliza, they belonged to different slave owners. Meeting was rare. George was clever, capable, and dignified. His master rented him to a factory where he worked. He loved factory work, invented a machine that boosted efficiency and gained renown. But his master couldn't tolerate it. "How can my slave outshine me?" Ignoring the factory owner's pleas, he dragged George back and abused him daily. As the slave owner put it, "Men like George get beaten for being too proud. If he'd just behaved, he'd be fine." An abolitionist retorted sharply, "So God made them human, and you must crush them into beasts?" George refused this fate. He escaped. During his flight, he met the factory owner who'd admired him. The factory owner warned, "You're breaking the nation's laws." George replied, "You have a country, I don't. Laws weren't made by us or for us. I'll fight for freedom till death. Your ancestors did the same. Is it wrong when I do it?" A profound question. Didn't the English flee to America seeking freedom from persecution too? Why is this continent free only for white people, not for blacks? Early next morning, the Shelbys and slave trader discovered Eliza had escaped with her child. Mrs. Shelby was secretly relieved. She'd opposed selling slaves for debt. As a mother, she understood Eliza's choice, so she deliberately delayed pursuit. Horses missing, calling everyone to eat, buying precious time. When Eliza reached the Ohio River, night had fallen. With no ferry, she planned to sleep and cross at dawn. But just as she settled, she spotted the slave trader's posse approaching. Eliza decided instantly she must cross now. Though early spring, the air bit cold. The river ran narrow. Ice floes drifted on the water, freezing currents ahead, baying hounds behind. Clutching her child, Eliza shouted encouragement, leaping ice to ice with all her strength. Shoes lost, socks torn, each step left bloody marks. Driven by resolve to die rather than be separated from her child, Eliza reached the far shore and collapsed, rescued by strangers. The Fugitive Slave Act was new. Aiding escapees was illegal. Yet Eliza's rescuer was a senator who'd recently voted for this law. Now a black slave needed help. What to do? Senator agonized. When voting, he truly believed the law right. Slaves were property, escaping was criminal. Escaped slaves were fugitives, so withholding help made sense. But when a living escapee stood before him, he realized it wasn't so simple. This woman's slave hadn't murdered or burned. She just refused to be parted from her child. Blood dripped from her wounds. Pale and trembling, she could barely stand. Shivering, clutching her child, anyone would be moved to compassion. Amid his hesitation, the senator's wife spoke. I don't care about laws. I see an innocent soul needing help right here. I'm a Christian, and God will support me in this. So the senator and his wife helped Eliza inside, cared for her, then personally drove her through pouring rain and muddy roads to safety, risking exposure. Later, the maid Eliza unexpectedly reunited with her escaped husband George. Armed and aided by local free blacks, they reached Canada and started anew. As for Tom, the slave trader shackled him for transport to the Deep South slave states. The southernmost U.S. states were ideal for cotton, hence had highest slave demand and were staunchly pro-slavery. There, brutal labor and relentless violence made it the most feared destination for slaves. On the southbound ship, Tom met a little white girl named Eva. Eva, another central character besides Tom, was just 6 but lacked childlike plumpness, graceful and kind-hearted. Stowe called her God's little evangelist, an angel sent to save souls. To Eva, blacks and whites were equal. She often played with black passengers. Eva was drawn to Tom's woven trinkets, but his sorrowful eyes moved her to beg her father to buy him. As slave owners put it, you must make an example of runaway slaves to deter others. But despite deep fear, Eliza didn't hesitate. She grabbed some food, took Harry, and fled. On her way out, she urged Uncle Tom to escape quickly too. During his master planned to sell him, Tom was heartbroken. He devoted most of his life to the plantation. He'd worked alongside the master and watched young master Shelby grow up. He'd built a family here, never betraying his master. Yet now he faced this fate, wondering if he'd ever see them again. So while he understood Eliza's flight, he couldn't run himself. He was the master's most trusted servant. Tom, his pride. He chose to stay and obey. Tom's submission contrasted sharply with Eliza's husband, George, a defiant slave spirit. George's father was white, his mother black, but the law then determined status by the mother's lineage. Thus, George couldn't escape slavery. Though married to Eliza, they belonged to different slave owners. Meeting was rare. George was clever, capable, and dignified. His master rented him to a factory where he worked. He loved factory work, invented a machine that boosted efficiency and gained renown. But his master couldn't tolerate it. How can my slave outshine me? Ignoring the factory owner's pleas, he dragged George back and abused him daily. As the slave owner put it, men like George get beaten for being too proud. If he'd just behaved, he'd be fine. An abolitionist retorted, so God made them human, and you must crush them into beasts? George refused this fate. He escaped. During his flight, he met the factory owner who'd admired him. The factory owner warned, "You're breaking the nation's laws." George replied, "You have a country, I don't. Laws weren't made by us or for us. I'll fight for freedom till death." Your ancestors did the same. Is it wrong when I do it? A profound question. Didn't the English flee to America seeking freedom from persecution too? Why is this continent free only for white people, not for blacks? Early next morning, the Shelbys and slave trader discovered Eliza had escaped with her child. Mrs. Shelby was secretly relieved. She'd opposed selling slaves for debt. As a mother, she understood Eliza's choice, so she deliberately delayed pursuit. Horses missing, calling everyone to eat, buying precious time. When Eliza reached the Ohio River, night had fallen. With no ferry, she planned to sleep and cross at dawn. But just as Eliza settled to sleep, she spotted the slave traders' posse approaching. Eliza decided instantly she must cross now. Though early spring, the air a bit cold, the river ran narrow, ice floes drifted on the water, freezing currents ahead, baying hounds behind. Clutching her child, Eliza shouted encouragement, leaping ice to ice with all her strength. Shoes lost, socks torn, each step left bloody marks. Driven by resolve to die rather than lose her child, Eliza reached the far shore and collapsed, rescued by strangers. The Fugitive Slave Act was new. Aiding escapees was illegal. Yet Eliza's rescuer was a senator who'd voted for it. Now a slave needed help. What to do? The senator agonized. When voting, he believed slaves were property. Escaping was criminal. Escaped slaves were fugitives, so withholding help made sense. But when a living escapee stood before him, he realized it wasn't simple. This woman hadn't murdered or burned. She just refused separation from her child. Blood dripped from her wounds. Pale and trembling, she could barely stand, shivering, clutching her child. Anyone would be moved to compassion. Amid hesitation, the senator's wife declared, "I don't care about laws. I see an innocent soul needing help. I'm a Christian, and God supports this." So they cared for Eliza, then braved torrential rain and muddy roads to deliver her to safety, risking exposure. Later, Eliza reunited with her escaped husband, George. Armed and aided by free blacks, they reached Canada to start anew. As for Tom, the slave trader shackled him for transport to the Deep South slave states. The southernmost U.S. states were ideal for cotton, so they had the highest slave demand and were staunchly pro-slavery. Brutal labor and relentless violence there made it the most feared destination for black slaves. On the southbound ship, Tom met a little white girl named Eva. Eva, another central character besides Tom, was just 6 but lacked childlike plumpness, graceful and kind-hearted. Stowe called her God's little evangelist, an angel sent to save souls. To Eva, blacks and whites were equal. She often played with black passengers. Eva was drawn to Tom's woven trinkets, but his sorrow moved her to beg her father to buy him. Her father asked why, and she said, "I want to make him happy." So Tom became a slave in Eva's household. With Eva's companionship, he enjoyed peaceful comfort. Tom always accompanied Eva outdoors. When he wrote letters home, she'd flutter over to help. Her golden head near Tom's dark one, they'd earnestly compose letters despite limited literacy. A neighbor's black maid, named Prue, had 12 children, all sold away. When her 13th child cried for milk, her master forbade nursing. She watched it die helplessly. Tormented Prue numbed herself with alcohol. People saw her drinking, thought she deserved scorn, not knowing her master caused her pain. Eva was heartbroken hearing this. She told her father, "That poor maid, children were her everything, yet she heard their cries, powerless." And a third incident, Tom helped 2 women slaves escape. Legree tortured him, demanding their whereabouts. Tom said, "I know everything, master, but I won't tell. I'd rather die." During Tom's suffering, the Shelby estate heir kept searching for him. After long efforts, he found Tom beaten near death and sadly watched him pass before giving him an honorable burial. Go back. Afterwards, the young master gathered the household slaves, saying, "I'll do everything possible to secure your freedom. You won't be torn from wives and children, drifting in foreign lands or dying abroad, like Tom." The author titled this chapter, "The Martyr," because Tom, like Jesus, suffered to protect others. Despite physical torture and death threats, his spirit remained unbroken. Ultimately, his death awakened others, liberating slaves from their suffering. Stowe later recalled Tom's ending came to her suddenly. After lunch, she wrote it in one go. Reading it to her husband, tears streamed down. He wept too, saying, "Not a word needs changing. This is perfect." The story ends here. The book caused an immediate sensation. The first 5,000 copies sold out in 2 days. Reprints followed continuously. Its popularity far exceeded Southern authorities' expectations, sparking panic. A Southern bookseller was even driven from town for selling it, and Stowe received constant hate mail and threats. The South feared Uncle Tom's Cabin because it dismantled slavery's justifications, religious, legal, and economic. First, religiously. The South claimed the Bible didn't oppose slavery, since biblical figures owned slaves, but pro slavery factions ignored Scripture's universal virtues, tolerance, and love. Stowe was a devout Christian. Her characters followed biblical teachings. Tom's obedience exemplified this. He firmly believed, "I rest in God's palm, accepting all fate's arrangements." Even 6-year-old Eva was a faithful believer. She urged her father to free slaves and taught them to read, true embodiments of God's teachings. Second, legally. America's founding established state sovereignty, so Southern states claimed the right to adopt slavery. But as George declared, these laws were made by whites, by slave owners, never with slaves' consent. Enslaved people believed such laws had no authority over them. Lawmakers who voted for them, like the senator who saved Eliza, weren't heartless, just ignorant of slaves' realities. Once awakened, they joined abolition. Finally, economically, Southern states claimed slaves' living standards weren't bad, a very weak argument. To slave owners, slaves were investments. They guarded against losing value. So, some slaves' conditions weren't worse than free laborers, but only differing between misery and greater misery. Moreover, slaves were forbidden literacy, Christianity, even family ties. Some, like Topsy, didn't know their own age. To slave owners, slaves were talking livestock. Even obedient, capable ones like Tom met tragic ends, no security, let alone dignity. Thus, through tear-jerking stories, Stowe exposed slavery's cruelty across religion, law, and economics, convincing America of abolition's necessity. This explains why Lincoln received Stowe in the Civil War's second year. Then, Northern armies suffered defeats, even doubting the war's legitimacy. So Lincoln decided this unity-preserving war needed a nobler cause: victory through emancipating slaves, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was when it caught Lincoln's attention. Literally profound, the novel moved readers deeply. Pragmatically, it powerfully refuted Southern slavery's excuses. Thus, Lincoln's meeting with Stowe, calling her the little lady who started this great war, wasn't a joke, but a calculated political declaration. It helped the North claim moral high ground, winning broad public support. The novel moved countless readers not just by portraying slave suffering. Stowe crafted diverse characters under slavery, telling their stories with nuance, building massive grassroots support for thorough, sweeping critique. Now, I'll specifically discuss 3 types of people: slave owners, slave traders, and ordinary citizens. Slave owners are a highly divided group. There are those like Eva's father and Shelby, who never beat or scold slaves, treat them quite leniently and kindly, even teach them to read and write. Then there are slave owners like Legree, who squeeze all value from black slaves while providing the worst living conditions. However, the author, through a character, points out that kind slave owners like Shelby create an illusion that slaves' miserable fate is only due to some cruel masters. But in reality, the system itself is evil. Black people's fate shouldn't depend on their master's character, but on their own control. Otherwise, situations like Eva's father's happen. As a kind slave owner, he intended to free all his slaves, but died suddenly from illness, plunging those slaves into worse misery. Falling into slave traders' hands, they're treated like livestock to be picked. Slave traders are seen as the most evil group by black slaves. They're the ones who take slaves to the South and sell them to brutal masters. Ooh, ooh, ooh. When describing the slave market scene, Stowe breaks from the story to shout out, "Who created the slave traders? Who should bear the blame? Slave traders are just inevitable products of slavery, and the educated people are the very upholders of this system. It's you, educated folks, who allow the slave trade to exist. Where are you, civilized people, any better than slave traders?" This question is truly deafening and thought provoking. Stowe saw the fundamental evil of slavery. Slave traders are so cold blooded and cruel precisely because the country condones slavery. Every senator who votes for it, every citizen who speaks in support is an accomplice to slave traders. Beyond slave owners and traders, Stowe also describes many ordinary citizens, bystanders who may never participate in the evils of slave trading or abuse, perhaps like Eva's aunt. They talk about freeing slaves but still harbor prejudice and alienation in their hearts. Dickens once sharply pointed out that even Northerners who support abolition feel uncomfortable encountering Black people in public, like a cat seeing a dog invade its territory. So long after emancipation, Black people still faced discrimination and segregation from whites, all lingering poison from slavery. Stowe's character portrayals show slavery's evil lies not in individuals, but in the system itself and every citizen supporting it. This forced every American reader to confront their conscience. Where do I stand in this abolition fight? Am I too an accomplice to slavery? Thus, with gentle yet unyielding power, Stowe planted seeds of abolition in countless readers' hearts. Yet we must see, while writing of slavery, Stowe explored humanity's good and evil, sin and punishment. In her writing, Eliza harbored no resentment, only gratitude toward the master who sold her son. She'd overheard the Shelbys. Selling Harry was unavoidable. Mrs. Shelby even begged to work off the debt herself. Consider Legree, who killed Tom. His mother was a devout, gentle Christian, while he inherited his father's cruelty. She often admonished him. In those moments, Legree felt fleeting unease, but soon ignored her pleas. On her deathbed, his mother still prayed for him. Her love became a guilty verdict, deepening Legree's torment. As the novel states, "For the wicked and unrepentant, even the greatest love becomes condemnation, excruciating torture." This verdict plunged him into hell's abyss. Afterwards, he grew more tyrannical, drowning in debauchery and alcohol. Stowe reveals each character's multidimensional humanity, complex and nuanced. Thus, Uncle Tom's Cabin endures beyond a century. Translated worldwide, its relevance undiminished. Today, American slavery is abolished. Black and Chinese laborers have left behind brutal enslavement. Yet oppression and injustice persist, and divides between races and cultures remain. That's why characters like steadfast Uncle Tom, kind-hearted Eva, and those defying unjust laws still move us today. As Stowe wrote at the novel's end, "Every long journey has its end. The darkest night turns to dawn." All right, that's Uncle Tom's Cabin. We'll wrap up our discussion of this book here. The reading notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.